Welcome to another session of the Reclaiming Development course. Here we are with your host, Mario Picon, Director of the Governance Action Hub. Thank you for joining. We're going to give a few minutes for people to start joining in. We typically wait the first 5 minutes. Just stick with us. Today we're going to be talking about evidence. We're going to be talking about the politics of evidence, especially when you are looking at working within systems to change them. So hopefully you will like it. And if not, you can let us know too. Please disagree. That's what we're here to have a conversation. So we'll give it 2 or 3 minutes. Alessandra, do you want to say hi to everyone? Alessandra
Everyone.
Gramendi is joining us today.
So great to
Excellent.
see you. Thanks for joining us.
And well, Alessandra is going to be managing the chat in the Q&A. Please feel free to introduce yourself. She's going to be sharing a few prompts with the people connecting over Zoom and with the people connecting through LinkedIn Live. Welcome, everyone. In the meantime, first of all, I just want to confirm, Alessandra, can you confirm that I am currently projecting sharing
Yes.
the PowerPoint? Excellent, good. Just wanted to make sure of that. Good, I'm gonna have my notes here. So a few logistical things. As you have seen, we have been having series of lectures, like trying to build a common language around the future of development, trying to understand and learn from the way that we have approached development in the past, and what are the needs of the space in the future. So hopefully, regardless if you have followed us in throughout a few sessions or for the whole course, we have like a hardcore group of people that have been together throughout all sessions. Thank you very much. We understand that that is not possible for everyone. The time zones, right, may actually like intervene and not allow you to participate live. But we're very thankful for the people that have been looking at the material, that have reached out with questions. In particular, I want to reach Kayona. I don't know if she will connect or she will look at this later. I'll send her an email later, but she had a question precisely about catching up and the exam. So within the next 2 weeks, we're gonna release what is gonna be the test that you need to take just to get the certificate for this course. The test is gonna be a series of questions actually with prompts for you to try to understand your vision on the issues. This is not like a revision of a textbook concept and all, but it's more about applications and how you understand the problem, particularly after everything that we have been discussing throughout. So the question is supposed to motivate you, share a bit of your perspective, and what we are looking for is that you are able to connect with some of the concepts that have been discussed throughout this semester in the Reclaiming Development course. So we will release those exam questions within the next 2 weeks. So stay tuned. We will, of course, announce it and share it widely. So anybody that may actually not have been able to join us for several sessions can actually catch up, can connect, can share their perspectives. We will have 3 more lectures, right? We're consolidating a block of development challenges or like ways of looking at these different issues in the future. Today, we're going to be talking about evidence, as I mentioned. We'll have 3 more lectures, and then we will go back to the practitioners' dialogues. We will close the overall course early May. We will announce that combination of a lecture with a practitioner's dialogue. And we expect and we hope that many of you not only will show up, but also actively participate in that conversation in May. And with that, we will close. Remember, this is what we call the Reclaiming Development Project. The project includes several components. We have this course, the Reclaiming Development course, that is going to be complemented with the practitioner dialogues. We already had two, one on energy transition and systems, and another one on territorial development and multi-stakeholder engagement. We are going to have also workshops around skills, particularly skills that sometimes we call wrongly soft skills, the hardest skills of development in many ways. We already had one on facilitation. We'll have another one on narratives soon. We will announce the date very soon. And the point of those is to convene people within the network, people that have registered for the class or that are part of the Governance Explorers network of the Governance Action Hub, and that bring their own experiences and approaches, not only the challenges, but how they deal with them, to a conversation with their peers. Then we have the co-creation workshops, which will be kicked off in Zambia on Monday, May 4th. Will be in Lusaka in a collaboration with Action Aid Zambia. Very much looking forward to share more details. Please stay tuned to our social media channels and our website where we will be sharing more about this. We are calling participants from the RICECON conference that will take place in Lusaka those days, and in coordination with Action in Zambia, calling into several practitioners of development around issues of climate justice and development in Lusaka that day, Monday, May 4th. If you are around Lusaka, please join us. The idea is that those co-creation workshops, which we will have in Lusaka, we're looking at Rabat, we're looking at Lima, we're looking at Manila. We'll have dates for all those very soon. They actually are deep dives of the things that we have discussed in this course. We will basically build together collaboratively, like the outline or the details, depending on where we are, for strategies that are focused on durability, on resilience, that take into consideration the different challenges and complexities of systems. So hopefully it will be a great experience. And finally, all these inputs from the online classes, the in-person workshops, co-creation workshops, the dialogues, and so on, we're bringing them together into a collaborative publication to be released before the end of the year. And as we move forward with that editing process, we will come back to you, especially if you have shared ideas, perspectives, and all. And if you are okay with us sharing that with the world, you will be included as co-author of that particular session in the collaborative publication. So we're looking forward to this. It's a big project, as you did. This is just part, a component of a larger idea, a contribution to the field that we want to make, not as based on our own ideas, but based on your ideas and perspectives of where to go in the future. Hopefully, you will find it useful. And if you want to help, you want to know more, please reach out. All right. So it's 9:10. So now we can start our regular engagement. Welcome, everyone. As I was mentioning, we're going to have Alessandra engage with you, asking you a few questions. We see some familiar faces. I see Laura, I see Macarena, Shan Arthurs, welcome. Brendan Halloran, an old friend. Thank you very much, Brendan, to join. Of course, regulars as Victor Bor, TY. Thank you for joining. All right, excellent. So let's start with this discussion about evidence, all right? And again, you do not have to agree. What I'm going to present is actually a very different perspective, but this is a topic that is very close to me, to my heart, to what I have done over the years, because a good deal of my career has been focused on the generation and use of evidence, as I'll share today. But in that process, in that life, I guess that as many of us that have been working in this space, I have found a lot of frustration with the way that, one, we generate and understand and interpret the evidence on the supply side, but also on the demand side, how we end up using it. And most of the times, we treat the generation and use of evidence as a clinical process in a way, instead of understanding how is it that it is shaped and also shapes reality through the systems in which that evidence is applied or maybe not applied. So this is an important issue. So I'm gonna ask you first, right? Like I would like you to share with me, and please feel free to raise your hand. That way we can have a bit more of an interaction first. What is evidence to you? And why is it that it feels like the ultimate source of authority in our field? Anybody has any perspectives on like how is it that you look at evidence? What is it? What is considered evidence in general? Please feel free to raise your hand if so, or put your comment on the chat box. That's okay if you're a little shy, but Ale is checking just in case anybody raises their hand. So please, I'm gonna go proposing a way to frame this conversation. Please feel free also to interrupt me and raise your hand so we can just give you the mic. We are very much looking forward to hear your perspective. Otherwise, you're gonna hear me for an hour. You don't wanna do that.
Sorry to interrupt. I see Anu who is raising her hand.
Anu is back. Anu, please.
All right.
All right. Anu, the microphone is yours.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I did not raise my hand first because I wanted to hear other stuff. But okay, I thought okay, it's
Go
okay
for
for
it.
me to share.
Go for it. Help us frame the conversation, please.
Yeah. So evidence is an attribute within the M&D or synthesis process, which attributes to a development interventions outcome in a positive or negative manner. So it kind of becomes the means of verification and evidence are the most important attributes that determine that what the development intervention has made in terms of an impact and output in a development process. In simplified terms, evidence is the measure of the progress made that directly impacts the intended and unintended objectives of the program or project or strategy. So that is my reflection about what evidence is and how does it add value to the process of development.
Thank you. That is very helpful, right? Like in precisely the kind of tension that I wanted to raise first, right? Like because you may understand and use evidence, and the first thing that came to mind for you is like, is the evidence on the result of something that we did, right? Like, and for many others, when you are starting the process of decide what to do, it may be what helps you justify what you're gonna do next, right? So it's like there is continuum here, right? In a cycle. It's not just a tense thing that, well, I'm gonna be using evidence for policy making, but I'm generating evidence also based on other actions that you have taken in the past, or maybe in a different geography, or maybe even for a different issue, right? Now, typically in development, we have attached the discussion to evidence to the to the question about what, and it's typically about one type of intervention or maybe a set of interventions that are working together or at the same time trying to solve a particular problem. But now let me just to frame the discussion, right? Like so we are all in the same page here. Evidence is almost an obsession. It is a healthy obsession in the end. It's good to be committed to generate good evidence that informs good policymaking or good programming, right? Good action by the actors involved in a system in general. But we have to understand that also because of all the discussion that we had in the past about the bias of development practitioners, but also the bias of different individuals interacting within a system, right? Which in the end you are applying a particular intervention and from there generating the evidence, it is important that we understand that the concept of evidence was borrowed really into social sciences, including development, from two different parents, natural science and law. First, from science, we inherited this drive to validate or invalidate a theory through objective observation. From law, we inherited the idea of weight. Evidence is something with a value attached to it to reach a final verdict of what is truth. So we see two things too here. One is about objective observation, right? Like this idea of validating or invalidating a theory from science, from natural science. And from law, this idea of the weight of evidence, like something that with a value attached to reach in the end the truth. What you're pursuing is the truth. What this has created, right, in development is a truth-seeking mindset where we tend to believe, doesn't mean that everybody believes, but we tend to believe that if we just find the right evidence, the right policy will follow, almost as a logical, objective consequence. But here's the thing, as we have discovered, most challenges, more problems in development are actually very complex. Yet, this framework to go from the truth-seeking mindset, right, that if we just find the right evidence, the right policy will follow, right, is actually a problem, or is a framework that works well for a problem around organized simplicity. But what happens when the problem is one of organized complexity? Okay, so we have been arguing here that while many of our tools are proper and are needed for specific projects that are relatively simpler, right? When we are faced with complex issues, complex challenges in development, maybe the way that we approach evidence is actually not functional to be able to overcome them. So let me start with that, okay? Let me ask you these two questions then, right? Like, if you work on or you have used evidence in the past, and let's say that you present or you offer a policy brief to a client. Let's say that you work on a think tank, I don't know, maybe it is your case, that you work as an advisor in parliament, right? And you're trying to justify a course of action, okay? Typically, if you have done that, identify yourself here. Do you feel like a scientist presenting a discovery, or maybe a lawyer making a case? Think about it if you have had that experience, or if you haven't had it, just put yourself in those shoes in that particular moment. You have to actually inform the next step, the policy, the programming, the next intervention. What is it that it makes sense to do right now? Like, do you approach what has been done in the past and the way that you communicate about it as a scientist or as a lawyer? Now, if evidence is meant to discover truth, whose truth usually gets funded? That's the other big question, right? Because again, we treat many times evidence as super objective, but in the end, is it the truth that you were pursuing, or were you looking completely blindfolded and just trying to be so objective that you are willing to take any path that comes based on the evidence that you are generating? Just think about this, okay? Two motivation questions that are actually related to things that we have discussed in this class before. Okay, let me move to the next slide. Okay, and this has to do also with the idea of being wary of our own ideology, right? And what is it that we actually want to achieve? What is it that we actually want to prove sometimes? And how that in many ways affects the way that we approach the generation of evidence, but also how we talk about it or the way that we use it. So, first of all, evidence-informed policy, which is typically what we are pursuing, or the paradigm that we're pursuing in this sense, right? Like when we talk about evidence, Notice that I say evidence-informed. I'm not using evidence-based. There has been a whole discussion about this in the past. Evidence-informed policy is not just a single event. It is actually a life cycle. There are like 3 distinct stages, each one with its own political terms. Okay? The first is generation. This is where we decide what counts. And here, the challenges start with our own biases as researchers and also as practitioners. We are influenced by our own ideologies and our environment. We often decide the outcome we want and let that inform which indicators we build. Let me give you an example. I'm going to avoid names here. Okay? I have been lucky enough that I have worked with some of the most brilliant researchers in development out there, like from great institutions. And I have been part of what is called, or used to be called at least, the gold standard in evidence generation, right? Randomized controlled trials. Very good. I mean, like, by the way, I have nothing bad to say about the method. In any case, I do have sometimes a problem in the way that we use it, right? And that is something that we need to be aware of all the time. But what happens, right, if in that search for the truth, for the evidence, the numbers do not necessarily are giving you the result that you expect? Any researcher is going to be faced at some moment with that particular dilemma. Is it that the evidence is not there to support what you were researching about, or what you know that may be interpreted and used later, the selection of a particular tool, of a particular intervention? Or is it, which may be the case, that the indicators that we have chosen are not appropriate, and maybe we need to work with those indicators a bit? And that, as simple and as a technical, as nerdy as it may sound, it is a very important question that you have to ask yourself. Because at some point, it may be true that you need better suited indicators for the particular context or for the data that you collected and all. You may have to create certain indexes or combinations. And of course, you inform that based on what others have done in the past. But how much do we tweak or like change the indicators to actually approach ourselves more to the truth, or just to get the result that we are hoping to see? And that is something very important, because answering that question right, doing the right thing there, is extremely important, especially in a time when, like, so many people, because of their own interests, of course, or their own perspectives on the world, right, like try actually to undermine evidence. We, as producers of evidence, have a strong, large responsibility to actually keep in mind all these different things. The second stage, right, like, and there are a few resources you see in this slide. Particularly, I recommend development professional biases, right? The biases of development professionals, which is in the WDR, the World Development Report of the World Bank of 2015. Excellent resource, by the way. We'll have it in the syllabus for you in the bibliography. Perfect. So we're talking about the evidence life cycle. Okay. So the second point, the second stage in this life cycle of evidence is communication. And here we have to be very careful on the inequities in access to information, to the results, to the evidence, and the interpretation of results, right? What this means is that the facts, or what we call the facts, are actually never neutral. Interpretation of data and of the results and the use of that data make a huge difference in the direction of a program. And here, for example, there is something that we need to put out there, right? Like, on one hand, as soon as you generate the evidence, the way that you, the researcher, may interpret it, right, may be based on statistical significance, right? I'm not going to go through statistical significance here, but just talking about it, right? Like, and of course, if you have questions, we can discuss a bit more about this in Q&A. Raise your hand also if you would like a bit more of information about this. I'll say that. But does that mean that the impact in your analysis is statistically significant enough to say that that particular variable or tool or fact associated with that indicator, with that statistical significance, is the right way to go? Over the years, you will be surprised at how much, maybe due to temptation, right, like to just reach to a result and all, we have based entire policies sometimes on statistical significance, but we need also to consider the larger impact, right, like the magnitude of the impact of the statistical significance in the end. And many times we don't look at that, or we don't look at that enough. Or maybe it is seen by the person doing the research, but using a different way, right? When you are communicating the data, when you are interpreting the results. And that is a big thing. That may happen on the researcher side or on the user side, right? The policymaker that is actually trying to make sense of all this information of this paper with all these tables and all these little stars here and there. Okay, so the part on the translation of the information, the communication is key. And here the role, for example, of think tanks is extremely important. We have entire conferences, our friends are on think tanks, this group that groups a number of several think tanks from around the world every year. They will have their gathering in Rabat in May, in late May. This time, one of the core questions that I always grapple is about the impact that think tanks are making, and typically they look at impact in the sense of influence of policies based on evidence, right? There's a whole argument and long-standing conversation there about like how is it that we actually measure the impact of, for example, think tanks in being able to connect policies with evidence. And hopefully this framework will be helpful for that conversation too. And the final stage in this life cycle is the part of the use. This is probably the most contested stage, where we see the selective use of evidence to justify pre-existing pathways and the heavy hand of politics in how data is deployed. This is very important, you see? So it is no longer, you have this problem, you look at these options of policy, you do the analysis, right? You generate the evidence, and then it means that you have to go on one particular path. It's much more complex to that. We have our own biases, but we also have political influence in selecting what parts of the evidence you may use and which ones not to use. And it is important that we are aware of this. Remember, you can interrupt me at any point. Please raise your hand if you want to make a comment, if you want to share experience, right, from your own country or your own work. Maybe you have been frustrated by this in the past. Remember, if you don't share your stories, I will share my stories, and then we can be too long here. Let me pause here for a moment. Alessandra, anything that is coming in the chat or anything that you would like to raise, let me know.
Yeah, no, for the moment, no. I see Anu is sharing her experience in the chat, but yeah, we have hopefully other participants will share their experience as well.
Perfect. Then, Anu, I'm gonna go back to your experience on the chat box in a moment. All right. Let me just keep moving so we can just frame the conversation, and then we will have the open Q&A. Okay. So I'm gonna leave you with a couple of questions here for you, right? Like based on what we just discussed. So, does statistical significance always equal policy relevance? Let that sink. Does statistical significance always equal policy relevance? And then think of a think tank that you know, all right? Are they intermediaries for learning, or are they just providing evidence to support the specific special interest? This is nothing against think tanks, but it happens to be, right, that also there have been think tanks that have been funded by one particular view of the work, and then all the work that they produce ends up reflecting that initial point of view. This whole discussion about like if they are political, there are some that may be politically motivated or funded or constricted by their own governments is something important that we have to keep in mind too, right? Because in the end, if we don't do that right, or we are not open about it, or like it's not clear, what ends up happening is that you affect and undermine the reputation of the organizations, right? And what they are actually recommending, which may actually be a good thing, what they are actually recommending made and analyzed in good faith. But these questions are important for credibility. Okay? So the point that I wanted to make from this, especially from the side of somebody that has worked on producing evidence for many years, is that we often pursue statistical significance while losing the capacity to identify the unforeseen consequences that actually drive systems. Most of the times, it's not just we do A and we get B. Okay? Now, let's talk a little bit about what in the literature is called the rigor trap. All right? And this is going to have to do with some discussions on some tools, methods, right, to generate evidence that I believe in, right? Like, but that I understand that it is not about the tool, it's about what we're trying to do ultimately. Okay? So look at this slide, right? The rigor trap limits visibility in complex environments. Doesn't mean that the discussion or the focus on rigor is a bad one or that we shouldn't have it. By all means, we need as rigorous evidence as possible. That is important. But it's more about the lens on like how do we approach it, and then how do we talk about it, and then how we use it. So first of all, you may have heard about this before or not. You may be more or less familiar. That's perfectly fine. Remember, you can always go back to the notes, the bibliography that we share with you, and these slides, which all will be on our webpage later today. Okay? Now, in the early 2000s, okay, you had Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo in particular. They were probably the most well-known representative heads, right, like of the movement towards rigorous evidence in development, right? They argued that we need to think again. That's actually the name of the chapter that we recommend you read from their book in the references in the bibliography that we're sharing. They and many others in the end advocated for randomized controlled trials to solve concrete problems. Like, for example, right, like to give bed nets away or sell them, and what will have better results in terms of less morbidity and less mortality. Like, solve concrete problems one at a time. Okay, that is probably the main takeaway of that chapter in the book. What they call it, and particularly this comes from Esther Duflo, is the plumber approach. Is powerful for answering specific questions. And this comes actually from a story that I heard at a podcast of Esther Duflo years later, right? Which comes from the idea that actually her father used to tell her, you should actually marry a plumber. Why? Because they solve things. They look at things in a particular way, and they do what is most practical to solve a concrete problem. Right. And it's so interesting that this approach or this way of looking at things is reflected also in her writing over time. Now, that is a very good thing, right? Like, you take a particular problem, right? You focus in answering that problem with the right tool. Okay? And proven. And then based on experience, also you react. But the way that is typically interpreted, right, is as this direct connection between the tool that we need that has been tested, that you know that is going to work for a particular problem. But this is the tension. You remember that in class, when we were talking the first class, we talked about tension and then the need for friction and then leverage, right? But if most real life challenges, climate, democracy, agency, okay, are organized complexity, okay? If we only focus on what we know for sure, we can know for sure through randomization, right? Then a normal consequence, all right, we are humans and we like simplicity in the end. We may actually abandon the most important systemic questions because they are not passive of randomization. We tend to treat problems of complexity as if they were problems of simplicity. Then what we end up doing is scratching the surface with average statistics, but then we ignore the quantum reality of development, okay? Where the units are entangled, uncertain, and do not behave in law-like ways, okay? Now, remember or recall our last conversation about the state capture, okay? And how complex it is, right? Like in how we made it very distinct, the conversation, not about corruption, but about state capture, and how state capture is completely different than corruption, even though we tend to just mesh them and we try to use the same tools to control corruption to control or reduce state capture. And then we get in a trap, okay? Now, if we cannot randomize a strategy to state capture, to tackle state capture, should we stop trying to build evidence for it? Think about this. Are we seeking like ideal answers, or are we willing to adopt an evolutionary approach to evidence? And this is a little bit what we're going to be talking about right now, okay? We are going to treat, in fact, evidence as a narrative infrastructure. Okay, first of all, we have to remember something that we discussed 2 weeks ago, okay? Was it 2 weeks ago or a bit? No, it was a bit more because we had the practitioner dialogues. When we look at systems, right? And we talk about Donella Meadows, right? Like her work particularly on leverage points, okay? All right, here it goes. Let's see if anybody remembers out of this. Anybody like that would like to share what do you remember about parameters, paradigms, feedback loops, information flows? Let me know. Ale, also just interrupt me if there is something on the chat that we should probably comment on.
All right,
Okay?
thank you.
Super. So I'm gonna keep moving, but please, let's try to remember what we did weeks ago, okay? First of all, if we want to work within systems to shape them, we need to move, we discussed this weeks ago, right? Like the evidence from the bottom of the ladder, what are here in your graph called parameters, right? The evidence about this concrete, the evidence about the training program. It is extremely important. You want to have that, but you also need to move your approach to evidence, which is necessarily going to have to require changing your toolkit for generation and use of evidence, right? Like to focus or start focusing a bit more on higher levels in the ladder, up to even the top, which are the paradigms. And the argument I'm trying to make here is that to do this requires treating evidence as a narrative infrastructure. So here the way on like the narrative around evidence and how do we use it, particularly in politically charged environments, is key. and this becomes a bit more of an art than a science. Maybe over time we'll figure it out the best way to actually do this, right? But certainly this is in this time and age, right? Like this discussion about people should take the evidence for granted because it's objective, right? The policymakers should just take the evidence for granted because it's objective. We can insist on that. It's a good aspiration to have, but we're likely gonna keep hitting a wall constantly, which is very frustrating too, okay? Now, I'm gonna rely a lot on the work of two friends here, particularly Florencia Gersovic and Tom Aston. And hopefully, I don't know if Florencia and Tom will hear this at some point, I can bring them in for a practitioner dialogue soon that goes more into the practical things of what we're gonna discuss. But we're gonna rely a lot on their recent work. This is 2024, 2025, okay? Now, in a complex system, we have already discussed this. People do not change their behavior just because of a spreadsheet, right? Because you are telling me this is what the data tells me to do. We talk about biases, we talk about ideologies, we talk about what's the name of the word is just escaping me right now. We talk about the position of different people in society, right? And how they are willing to defend it at all costs many times, or just looking only at the pieces of evidence that frame and favor their own views of the world, right? People actually change their behavior because of a new narrative for change makes sense of that reality, of their reality. Otherwise, you are just gonna go and think and try to defend as much as you can the view of your own tribe, of the people like you, right? Like the people that believe what you believe, of your neighbors, what is perceived by your community, right? Also because you are gonna probably want to preserve your own position in the current system if it is benefiting you comparatively. So again, let that think, okay? People do not change behavior because of that data. They change because a new narrative for change makes sense of their reality. This is extremely important. In that flow that we saw before, this connects the idea of generation with evidence with the communication of it. All right? What Florencia and Tom call in their work the learning for steerage. You remember that we used to say, like, we talk about governance as a process of steering, right? Like, because you have to navigate in unknown waters, right? Like, that is the simile, the metaphor that we were raising for it. So what they are calling this view of this understanding on how to generate and use evidence is more about learning for steerage. You aren't just proving a point. You are using evidence to help a coalition navigate a complex mess without losing its way. There are no maps here. You have a compass, all right? So how do you use that learning in ways that helps you steer in the complexity, rather than just trying to see the clinical way of like, I get the evidence to solve this problem, when the problem may not be as simple of concrete as you wish it was. Okay? Now, how do we build this evidence-grounded narrative, right? Like that is the big question, right? Like, so they actually have some suggestions for this, right? And I'm gonna basically go straight from their work, which I really like. And I really recommend that you guys take a look at it, okay? So the first thing that they recommend is to identify the plot of the system, like the story plot, right? Like the script, the storyline, right? Like when you are like looking at participating of a movie, all right? Is your system's story one of fixes and backfires, or is more like accidental adversaries? These are just different ways of identifying the plot of the system that Meadows and others have looked at in the past. I guess this is Stoll and on social sciences too that has some discussion on this. If anybody remembers, let me know. So evidence should reveal the patterns. What are the patterns in the system? Making those unintended effects that we talk about visible to everyone in the room. That is not necessarily the way that over the last 15, 20 years we have been treating evidence. But it's a very important way if we are going to start using evidence to navigate in a system. So beyond if I increase 10%, this cash transfer is going to generate this number of people in school, okay, which is an important thing to know, right? To try to understand what are the unintended effects on it. Are the people just going to send the kids, but then they are not going to care really if they learn or not? Or like you will make, in the end, make many of these kids work after hours, right after school until late. What are the unintended consequences? What are the stories behind, right? Like what are the things that we have to watch out for? What is it that we can control and what is it that not, right? Is that particular program just being approved so the political officer of that particular district or country or region actually benefits for the election and he or they are just using it for their political benefit, right? Doesn't mean don't do it, but you need to keep that in mind. Okay? The second point is to acknowledge the differences first. When I used to work at this organization called 3IE, the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, they are the ones that I guess created, or in any case adapted, a tool that I found very useful, and I was able to have the opportunity of working on a few of these, called the maps of evidence, the evidence gap maps in particular. And typically those were done to try to understand where are gaps of information, where are the particular instances between what we do and what we want to achieve, where like there was not enough information, not enough evidence. So if I had to do an evidence gap map with an eye on systems, then what I would like to map probably are the incentives and the power relations of the different actors working on the system. Because in the end, we talk about the aspiration of development, right? And how the focusing on growth implies a different level of ambition than focusing on agency, for example, right? If you think Zen, okay? If development aims to unleash agency, then your evidence must prove to local actors, that you understand their constraints, their status, and their local politics. So again, it's not just enough, like you generate the evidence, you publish it out there, and you wish that somebody like takes it. Or if you have the opportunity of connecting with making that policy happen, it may not even be enough to just have a good communication or memo plan or like policy memo or policy analysis for the government in place. Because in the end, if the people that you need to change their behavior are not aware or understand that you're actually looking at their own constraints, chances are it's not going to have the effect that you expect. It may be statistically significant, right? But you're not telling the story behind, or you're not uncovering the story behind. Let that sink for a moment, okay? So let me go over this, right? We talk about that three things that we are highlighting here in terms of like how to build this evidence-grounded narrative, okay? Identify the plot of the system, okay? You should reveal the patterns. Make the unintended effects of programs or interventions or policies or reforms, okay, visible to everyone, okay? then be the first in acknowledging differences. And by doing that, you need to map the incentives and the power relationships of the different actors in the system. Okay? You must prove local actors that you understand their constraints, their status, and their local politics. And I'm going to go through the third advice there, which is called build coalition glue. And before I do that, I'm going to go to questions. I have a hand raise. Who's this? Anu. Anuradha?
Yeah. Thanks, Mario.
Please go ahead.
I thought this is very interesting, the climbing the systems ladder, depicting, both the micro and the macro environment in governance, in terms of governance. I just want to share this and also ask for your reflection in depth on this. I can relate this to two scenarios. One is an establishment where, say, it can be related to performance, where performance counts, but there is always a composite factors other than what you just mentioned, like a relationship, or probably performance that's not directly accountable only to you but to many others. um, for instance, or it could be that there is no quantified method to kind of translate a lot of performances which are not in the form of KPIs. That's scenario one in terms of establishment, where performance as a team, performance as an individual, and also adding to a lot of things related to an institutional growth and vision. These cannot be quantitatively measured. In a macro environment, I can relate this systems ladder to, um, like for instance, the ease of doing business program, where a lot of things are measured very quantitatively and qualitatively at a city level. Like that's the World Bank standard. So I had the privilege of being the first team which started this ease of doing business project with the World Bank many years before. But I know it's reformed now. So the indices are very concerned with only two cities in a country, but those are highly quantified and those are very specific. And it somewhat correlates to the index and the ranking that it gets globally, but
Yeah.
it depends upon which two cities are being picked. And that is a strategy in itself. And that is done through consultations. So it may not be an exact measure, but it is also to promote competitiveness and to also to say you wanted to make sure that the interventions you make out of that exercise, not it's not about the ranking, but you wanted to promote it to ensure that it promotes your economy very nicely, because these policies and indices or ranking directly are like processes which are diagnostic processes which tell a government how they can improve their GDP by improving policies, incentives, and measures. I want to know a reflection comparing a micro and macro environment individually within its own ecosystems. What could be the difference it could make in a new public governance, or something new that can ensure that the systems need not have exact standards, but to make sure it adds a positive development for itself and its own internal stakeholders. This is my thought that I thought you can reflect more on this.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That actually gives me a lot of food for thought. Um, please, again, anybody, I know that, well, Anuradha is already like he's very much familiar of how we have been doing this, because he's one of the people that has been here for most, if not all, of the sessions, and thank you for that. But if
Thank you.
anybody wants to also raise your hand, make a comment, share an experience, right? Like you can do that at any time, and we will also have like a chance, right, a moment for additional questions or follow-ups, okay, where we can share a bit of a story. We could have drinks or coffee or tea about this, and it will definitely take a while. But for now, I'm just gonna say something in reaction to what you're saying, Anurad. All the things very important and true. you may actually have like a good selection of indicators, a good index that helps you track and all. And you mentioned the issue of rankings, for example, right? We are all humans. We all tend in the way that we reason and the way that we act or that we use the information, right? Like we strive, we like simplicity. We like, don't make it over. I know the word is complex, the word is complicated, right? Like, so, but give me the easy thing. What do I need to do? So indexes, rankings based on indexes, right, like are very tempting in that sense, and they may actually get the job done. But the point is that even if it works for everybody in the short term, when you start including this nuance of having a system perspective of it and you understand that the different people in the system start adapting, reacting, supporting, or pushing back to your efforts, right? Like they're going to find ways to actually maybe change a bit or maybe preserve their own status in the system. Very concrete example, you can look if you haven't heard about this case in the last few years, right? Like it is with the business index, business openness. I forgot the name of the index of the World Bank. They publish it every year. They're like doing business index at the World Bank, ranking companies. Basically, you go and ask a number of different private sector representatives from each country, right? Like how easy or how difficult or how much problematic maybe to open a business, to develop a business, etc., etc., etc. And there are rankings for this over the years. Sadly, a few years ago, it was discovered, right, that there was manipulation of that data, of the way that the index was actually published to benefit certain countries or making them look better compared to others. And it was a huge scandal around this. And of course, that mined the credibility of the index itself. So even if you were ranking poorly in the business, you can always say, well, that index doesn't work in the end. But the point is that when you just leave it alone, the point is that the different actors try to react, try to adapt, and they adapt positively, right? And in the direction that you would like to see them reacting, or sometimes negatively, even trying to manipulate the tool. In the end, what happened, they brought like a great guy like Norman Loaiza at the World Bank to basically completely revamp the system of that index and regain the credibility that it used to have in the past. But that took a few years, and that lack of trust that generated, right? Like it's very hard to bring back, right? Like so, you may argue that index was based on the best evidence possible given the particular problem that we are looking at. That is not hard data, really is more based on interviews with a large number of private sector representatives, right? Government representatives and so. But still, it was a standard used every single year. And then the standard, like, is also affected by the reaction, the behavior of the different actors that are affected, potentially benefit, or potentially harmed by the results, by the evidence. Very important also for the story of some countries, some governments trying to control, for example, the work of think tanks. Okay? All right. So we talk about identifying the plot of the system. And by the way, I'm very sorry. I always do this. I start talking, I get very much into it, and I forget to just move through the slides properly. But of course, you'll have these to share and to see later today. On the slides, right? Like we're talking about, and that was the name of the book, Straw, in the previous slide. You'll have it also in your reference. This all view of evidence compared to learning for Stirash, which is very much appropriate when you start looking at systems, right? Let me just pass it here. I want to make sure that we're in the right one. So we talk about building evidence-grounded narrative, and we talk about identifying the plot of the system, acknowledging differences first, okay? And then comes the third element that Gersovic and Aston talk about, which is this building this coalition glue, okay? How is it that we use or can we use or should use evidence to find the common ground that can actually be defended, quoted, okay? Use evidence to find the common ground that can actually be defended. They call this social accountability 3.0. But there's much more here than just social accountability. It's very like this connection of social accountability with evidence and the use of evidence. I guess that is very good and key. Okay, what does this mean? This means moving from voice to systemic responsiveness. How do we respond as a system, as players, as individuals within a system with different perspectives, maybe with different roles, maybe in the government, maybe in civil society, maybe in private sector. Recall our work, our past lessons on multi-stakeholder governance, for example, right? And having all these different views. Why is it a promise and why many times it fails? Okay, now moving from voice to systemic responsiveness by co-producing evidence that powerful actors find hard to ignore because it is co-owned by the coalition. This is important because this is no longer like the expert researcher PhD in economics only, right? Like generating the evidence, just putting it in the word, and then maybe having an intermediary like a think tank just putting it in the right pieces of communication or engaging the policymakers, etc. So typically the role of a think tank ends up in the dissemination. You may have very nice infographics, you have these special pages on your website, maybe you have a nice report, right? Like maybe you get it to be discussed in Congress, which is great. But is that evidence and the results of it co-owned? Do you have a coalition that can actually defend or make those results harder to ignore by the policymakers? That's the big question. So this is another way in which coalition and coalition building is key in the way also that it's not just that you support a solution to a shared problem, but how you tackle it implies also how is it that you are potentially co-generating, but at least using the evidence to make it harder to ignore by different people in the system. So in the end, we are moving, right, like from like the evidence generator, right, from being experts to who deliver truth to facilitator strategies, right? Like who provide infrastructure for distributed learning. I know this may be like, wow, this is crazy, right? Like, how do we do this, etc. But again, this is why these different elements that we have been discussing over the weeks are in the end connected. We talk about evidence today, but in the end, you see, we're connecting with the concept of systems. We're talking about coalitions. We're talking about strategies. And this is where we're looking at the how, right? Like this view of like, let's take evidence, evidence says this, so this is what we should be done, this becomes nuance. Because in getting the support from a strong coalition that can actually make the results hard to ignore, right? Like the only way to get there is that those people that own now or that are potentially defenders of that evidence need to see in the evidence, right, that those unintended consequences, that the politics, that the relations of power, that the constraints that they face are actually reflected in there. Otherwise, it's not going to be credible. Otherwise, they are not going to own it. And if they don't own it, they are not going to pursue it. So we could keep doing what we have been doing for many years, right? Just generate strong, rigorous evidence on whatever problem it is, okay? Let's just publish it. Maybe if you are in a think tank, you connect it with somebody that can actually make a decision about it. And then you say, well, we did our job, we put it in the face of people, but these people don't want to do anything. But what's next? Who is it, or what group of people can actually take that, own it, and actually make it alive so it is harder to ignore? And here is where those coalitions for change enter into the conversation. Okay? So if we go back to the paper from Think Again, right? Like in Banerjee and Duflo, right? Like they actually talk a lot about the 3 I's of policy failure. Okay, policy tends to failure because of ideology, right? You know, the predetermined outcomes that you want to see, right? Like ignorance, blindness to complex system plots, in this case, like trying to adapt it to the narrative of systems, or inertia, reliance on rigid train track approaches. Okay, and the point is that if we actually move from just being experts telling you, like the evidence says this, right, to being facilitator and strategies, this is also one reason why we had the workshop on facilitation, and the next workshop is going to be on narratives. How is it that you start connecting these things and you see these challenges coming together in practical ways? Hopefully this is clicking also for many of you, especially if you have joined other sessions and you have seen this, right? Then our approximation to the problem is different. So again, let me just make you notice something. I'm a big admirer of Banerjee and Duflo. Okay, I developed very much of part of my professional life, but looking at what they have done and the important trends that in their work. I do disagree, right, as many others too, right, like with the idea of like centering or lowering, that's how I see it, our ambition, like to specific problems that we can actually answer. I think that we have to keep both on the side of aspiration to goals, but also in the way that we try to generate evidence around what to do about them, right? Like we need to keep our ambition higher than that. Doesn't mean that the other part is not important. And yet I'm going back to their framework to see how in a systems conversation, this framework that they propose of policy failure being determined or defined by ideology, ignorance, and inertia, it still applies. It's just that the language, the way that we look at the 3 I's is a bit different. Now, the next time you're asked an evidence-based or evidence-informed solution, should I put evidence-informed? Like, will you offer a technical bolt-on, or will you try to offer a pathway for behavioral change? That is a fair choice that we have to make as a community, right? Generating or using evidence for development. That is a question that I want to leave to you in any case. I guess that's the last one. Yeah, that is the last one. So let me just finish with a couple of things that I wanted to mention before I forget. Let me look at my notes. So I have the grand finale in a way, and then we're going to have questions, okay? Alessandra, if you have ready the questions, let me know too, but I'm going to just look at my notes and make sure that I'm not forgetting this. Good. What is it that hopefully this has helped us doing, okay, in this class? I hope that you get the point that we are trying to move from viewing evidence as an objective finding to seeing it as a strategic instrument for action under constraint. A strategic instrument for action under constraint. Okay? So we talk about the strategies. How is it that you build the strategies? Right? Like, so evidence can help you, but we need to approach different evidence in a different way, right? Adapted precisely for complex environments rather than organized simplicity. Okay? So the first thing, and actually some of you say this in some of the first sessions that we had, right? Like the first thing when we think about policy failure, one of the first things that comes to mind for most people is, it failed because of corruption. Okay? Yeah, probably it fails because of corruption too. But in the end, policy tends to fail because either we have approached evidence and its application through as an ideology, or because of ignorance, or because of inertia. Okay? Now, we do not use evidence to end the discussion with a best practice. We use it to start a more honest discussion about trade-offs and political limits. That's my encouragement. That is the way that I'm approaching evidence now. And again, you're talking to a guy that has dedicated more than half of his career to the generation and the attempt to use evidence. My job at 3IE, aside of working on these evidence gap maps, right, all the technical work, was actually to serve with a bridge of evidence and evidence use with different government agencies in Latin America. Had the chance of meet amazing people, right? Coneval in Mexico, the Ministry of Social Inclusion, and the Minister of Education in Peru, the Minister of Education under Jaime Saavedra that we mentioned in a previous case, right, like that I shared. In Argentina, the city of Buenos Aires, right, like in their unit for evidence over there. I don't know if they are still there, hopefully so. In Paraguay, in Chile, and it was over and over the same discussion. Everybody wants the training, the capacity building, obviously on the generation and the look at evidence, on how do we bridge evidence, and all. But the solutions that I was bringing, and that made me very frustrated with myself, right? Like, because I didn't have other set of tools. That's the set of tools that I knew. Is basically just the argument that this is what the numbers tell you. This is what evidence tells you. So you should use this because it is objective, because it is clear, because it's clean. But then everybody will take the training, they will take the certificates, certainly, right? Like, but how do you actually use it? And that conversation will not come in the classroom. That conversation will come when we were having at night, having drinks. So are we collectively, regardless if you believe that this is the way to go or not, right? Just gonna stay in the bubble and just decide that we're gonna just continue the way that we learn back in college, maybe, or in a particular training that we should generate and just put evidence in the face of people? Or are we gonna admit that we need others for that evidence to live somewhere, so it doesn't just stay as a nice paper that may be actually forgotten after a few months? We must stop treating problems of organized complexity as if they were organized simplicity. So the next time you are asked for an evidence-informed solution, right, what will you do? Will you offer the technical bolon, or are you willing to go through the more unknown path of offering pathways for behavioral change? That I leave to you. I'm going to stop there. We have about 15 minutes to bring some stories, share what you want to share, Please write things in the chat. Alessandra, let me know if there's some things in the chat that we should bring about. Happy to answer questions during the next 14 minutes or afterwards. I see one hand. Anuradha, please.
Thanks, Alexandra. Hi, Mario. I just wanted to, this last slide is quite intriguing and it's very nicely made. I think it's a genuine, the illustrator style of putting a deeper development thought into a visual. I like the way that you put that ignorance, blindness to complex systems. So it can mean proxies, problems exist but not visible. The second is about understanding things like wicked problems, right? So intended and unintended outcomes. I think ignorance means both. I think, right? Because when I also was thinking deeply of how I should share a relevant example or how should I ask for a reflection, I was also thinking that, it's about capacities versus capabilities, right? So, and one should never undermine those two parameters in a very, lucid form when, assessing or even contributing or even reflecting upon a governance strengths or institutional strength or a program based capability, right? So my reflection, I want to know about your reflection on what you meant in terms of ignorance is the, an important aspect which is common. So um, maybe you can reflect upon the thoughts that I shared, or maybe a synthesis of what I mentioned as different scenarios. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anu. Before I go a little bit on that, let's collect other questions or comments. Alessandra, anything on the chat that we should?
We have an interesting comment from Laura or Laura. She reflects that coming from a natural science background, she may need to rethink what counts as evidence to make conservation efforts more effective.
Yeah, I mean, and again, this is not to tell you the way that you have been looking at evidence or doing things is wrong. It's more about opening our eyes to the fact that it is insufficient and actually easily manipulable. I always say this class, or the way that I approach the class at Maryland over the last few years, right? People either get very excited or extremely frustrated. And actually that's my intention, right? The point is, once you know or you understand or you open your eyes, right, to systems in particular and all these complexities, it's hard not to see it, right? And you have to see it also not as an immediate fix that you're going to be able to apply easily and immediately, because that's the point. The point is that it's not that simple, right? But as a very important superpower, if you want, because it's going to allow us to understand the problem and the bottlenecks in your work in a different way. And only understanding, identifying those bottlenecks, realizing that you work all your life or you work many years in a project to try to deliver good quality evidence, and then seeing it either ignored or taken apart or taken only partially, like the parts that are convenient to some, okay, can be extremely frustrating. So can we do anything about it? Can we engage with others? Can actually bring a lot of these understandings to life? And that is going to require two things: that you approach the generation of that evidence in a different way, in a way that actually identifies the patterns, those unintended consequences, and is able to look at this change these pathways of change, right? Giving options to the players instead of like just basically saying, this is the way, this is what the data says, and my method is as rigorous as possible. So you should do this. And if you don't do it, it's your problem. So most of the times, especially for complex challenges, right? One decision, because it is a decision, it is a strategic decision, right? Like may lead to change, right? The other one may lead to your work being published at a highly regarded journal, but not necessarily changing lives. Okay? Just mentioning. Again, it is a tool. The point is to improve. And improve, change behavior, get things better is not immediate. It's a process. Right? We have to also create the habit. I started to make a lot of these connections with past work, and I didn't have the language until I ran into the work of Florencia and Tom, right? And I actually, and this is the thing, I took a special interest in their work because I know them, especially Tom. With Tom, we have worked together in the past. With Florencia, I have talked a couple of times only. But I mean, like, it starts connecting with all this other side, right, of the conversation. And that's why I wanted to emphasize their work. And again, I'm not saying that Duflo and Banerjee were wrong. They were right? Assuming that the problem that you're looking is of organized simplicity, right? That it makes sense. What I disagree on is that we should limit ourselves. And actually, I would say, listening to Duflo and to Banerjee a little bit more too, over the years, I don't think, right, that is necessarily where they are going with their thinking, if certainly not today, right? But it is a very important and useful tool that trigger, as it should, a series of conversations more in depth about the issues. And about ignorance, very, very quick, Anuradha. Like, there is more on the reading, right, on that chapter about how they define ignorance in that sense, right? We typically understand ignorance as precisely not knowing, right? Like, what I'm trying to do is here to just opening up the conversation in terms more of blindness. Now, sometimes the blindness to the system, to the plots, to the storyline behind, to the unintended consequences, right, that are based on this relationship between the actors, may be because of ignorance, and some other times may actually be because ideology, right? So Laura was mentioning, right, like how she comes from natural sciences. There's nothing wrong with natural sciences, of course. And the generation of information with that particular paradigm, no pun intended, of like trying to validate or invalidate theories is a good way to approach things. It's more about the framing for the conversation and the awareness that that particular piece of evidence for that particular problem may only be tackling one small section of the overarching problem of the system. And that because the problem is within a system, and systems tend to stability, right? If the impact or the process or intervention is not large enough or supported enough or rallied enough, it may dilute over time because the system and other actors in it react, especially those that want to keep their own position within the system because it benefits them. Okay? I'm not saying this is not a fight between good and evil. This is about being aware of human behavior. Okay? Hopefully that is helpful. Other questions or comments, Alessandra?
We have one from Kitri. She joined from University of Texas. Unfortunately, she already left. But she noted that evidence alone doesn't move policy without power, and highlighted that the role of systemic thinking and soft power in advancing community data.
Can you repeat that part?
She noted that evidence alone doesn't move policy without power, and she also highlighted the role of systemic thinking and soft power in advancing community data.
Yeah, Mina, that's super important because in the end, like to you be able to use data, like you have to understand where that data is coming from, and that data needs to be credible. And the way that we tend to define credibility also is through the eyes of what is considered as objective, right? As possible. This is not about like it could be qualitative data, of course, based on perspectives, right? Like, but how credible the data is and the source, and what is like the discussion around politics and power in the generation of data too. This has to do with things as certain communities in certain parts of the world not being able to, for example, be surveyed properly, either because of concepts or things like remoteness or because of social status, right? I mentioned this this experience in a rural community, right? Like where we were looking at a financial inclusion program, right? Microcredit, and then microfinance settings. This was like in 2007, right? Like, and nothing that I had read in preparation or look at the data for loans that I had at that time would have prepared me or replaced the fact of being there and looking at the social dynamics. And then understand that the data was completely missing one complete part of the population in many of these villages. And they were not being served. So also your data may actually reflect some of those imbalances in power or inequities. So this is extremely important in terms of understanding. I will also add, by the way, really quick, because this is something that we run into with an randomized control trial that we did for microfinance in Pakistan years ago at the World Bank, right? That sometimes, because you believe so much in your method, and you focus on the method because you consider it rigorous enough, you forget sometimes that what you are looking for may actually already be addressed elsewhere. Very concrete example, okay, from the World Bank. We did this amazing randomized control trial, all these different work, a lot of care. I wasn't in the survey process. I came right after to the team. So I had to deal a lot with the management of the data, right? And the questions that we were asking from the survey, right? Like, kept us wondering, why is it that this is not working or this is not going the direction that we thought and all? And many of the answers to that had already been produced on a special report based on surveys in Pakistan 2 years before, or a year and a half before, by the IFC. But we had not been looking at that because sometimes there are already information out there that may give us some of the answers or explain what we're seeing in the data, right? And we may be forgetting to actually look consistently and carefully look how different pieces of information, even generated with a different methodology, right, may actually be important in helping us understand and interpret and translate the data, the results that we get, right? Even though it may be using a more rigorous tool or set of tools. We are gonna end, but I have one final question of Anuradha. So like maybe we'll have 5 more minutes. I understand if some of you have to leave. Thank you very much. Anuradha. Oh, Anuradha, was that a legacy question, hand? Are you there?
Hi. Am I audible, Mario?
Yes, now you are.
Okay, thank you, Alexandra. Mario, my question, I thought this would be very valuable discussion to do as a culmination. I know that you have a deep expertise in evidence synthesis and M&E. My question is, the whole of session summed up. We discussed a lot about global indices versus how the processes work at a regional or a field level, and things like social account. All this culminate to an index in different forms, like whether it's transparency, competitiveness, or growth or economy. So, does this exercises of evidence synthesis and systematic reviews, I'm talking about SRs and ES, would they reflect to some extent or to greater extent the correlation to those indices, because those are samples from different regions and different countries, and that will not have a bias. So I'm thinking, would that be the right methodology or the near closest methodology that will reflect what and how of why those countries have got those kind of ranking comparatively, than to undertake an independent, objective assignment, understanding, the nitty gritties? That's my question. Thanks.
Thank you. That's a very specific one.
Mario, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to flag that we have a question on LinkedIn Live if you want to answer that as well.
Please, can you do that?
Yeah, we have Stanley who is asking basically how can evidence be used effectively in contexts where political space is constrained, and how do we build the skills to link evidence with political insight in policy making?
You see, when we have the practitioner dialogue around this topic, I want to bring back this question, okay? Because what we need is like some concrete case to try to apply this. And this has to do, in the end, Stanley, thank you so much for that question, with the issue of how is it that you build a coalition, right, that is relevant for these things? How is it that you make the points or like that the evidence are making difficult to ignore, but you gather enough support for it also. So it is not just the experts are saying this, right? Oh, they don't know what they are talking about. They don't know us, etc. But that the consequence of that evidence in terms of what needs to happen is actually shared, understood, and pursued by others, not only the researcher or the ministry or like the think tank, right, that has generated the evidence. So this connects very much about like what is the relevant coalition for change. So certainly, if you have a constrained environment, maybe a government that does not want to do what is needed to happen for different reasons, political power, maybe doesn't benefit them, etc. Right? Obviously, it is much harder to actually affect change, especially if it is a government that you know that is going to stay there forever or for a long time, properly, because maybe probably because they are just controlled, I don't know, elections or however happens, right? Like I'm going to an extreme case. Because in a non-extreme case, you may think that even if there may not be the space for change in the short term, we need to start building, and we talk about this when we discuss windows of opportunity and also the Overton windows, right? How is it that we build a case for when that opportunity for change actually happens? We all talk about opportunity windows, but we rarely talk about how do we build the opportunity window for when change is actually possible, feasible. Those are more specific things that we could discuss more in areas of practice. But Stanley, if you have a concrete thing in mind, please email me, right? I would love to actually bring that into the conversation. Maybe in another session, you can share more about a problem, or we can do something more hands-on, and we can bring it up also to the speakers that we're gonna have in a few weeks. So that's one thing. I know that I cannot give you a comprehensive answer, but hopefully that gives you an element, right? A pathway precisely to explore that answer on your own based on the material. And feel free also to go and look at the bibliography, especially Pankhurst, 2017 on the politics of evidence, which is one of the references that we have there. And just finally, Anuradha, thank you so much about this. Yes. So again, systemic reviews, we talk about evidence gap maps, we talk about impact evaluations. Systematic reviews are an excellent tool, right? Like to try to bring some light into like a big cloud of different results, right? And evaluations all around. So for the benefit of everybody, yeah, the basic concept is you have a ton of of several evaluations on the same problem done at different times or in different countries, right? And where a systematic review for I'm just simplifying this. My old friend Birte will kill me if she hears me right now defining systematic reviews like that. But basically, ultimately, what you take is like a bunch of different evaluations, all rigorous enough, right? Maybe mixed methods, maybe randomized control trials, right? And all. And what you do is like for lack of a better term, you average the results. You average the results. That's what you have to do. And then what you have is bands in which you see like this tends to be significant. This intervention or serving intervention tends to be significant. So that's a problem. And something that you have to keep in mind. So it is very helpful. The problem is not the tool itself. It's very helpful to understand and synthesize evidence. The problem is like, what do you do with it? And what kind of information is given you? A good systematic review, it will also look at the nuance. It will look at the context in which these evaluations are happening. So something to keep in mind. And then how do you use that information to leverage change? Hopefully that is helpful. We'll have to interrupt the class now. I guess that we're over time anyway. I'm gonna declare it class dismissed. Thank you so much for being here. And hope to see you in the next session in a week. Take care of yourself, and we'll be in touch.